They say a grandmother's love knows no limits, but I never imagined mine would be tested at the gates of a wedding I paid for. I spent my whole life giving, quietly, constantly, thinking that someday someone would say, "Thank you, Mom," or "We couldn't have done this without you." Instead, what I got was a clipboard and a stranger's face saying, "Sorry, ma'am, you're not on the guest list." I stood there with my best dress on, a gift in my hand, and a heart full of memories. And in that moment, I realized this wasn't a wedding, it was a lesson. And someone was about to learn just how much this old music teacher still remembers about timing, silence, and consequence. If you've ever felt forgotten by the ones you gave everything to, this revenge story might feel a little too close to home. My name is Lorraine Whitley. I'm 75 years old, a widow for 18 of them, and a retired music professor from a quiet community college in Dallas, Texas. I spent most of my adult life teaching kids how to listen, really listen, not just to notes or tempo, but to feeling, to nuance, to silence between the measures. I raised my only son, Caleb, mostly on my own. His father passed too soon. Pancreatic cancer took him in under 6 months. Caleb was just 14 then, all knobby elbows and repressed grief. We clung to each other, made a life from scratch. I taught full-time, picked up summer classes, and did private piano lessons on the weekends just to keep the house and afford a little dignity. And then Madison came along, my granddaughter, Caleb's only child. I was 51 when she was born, and from the moment I held her in my arms, I knew my life had shifted. I wasn't just Lorraine the teacher anymore. I was Grandma Lorraine, the steady hand, the soft lap, the second mother. Her own mother, Caleb's wife, left when Madison was 4. A brief and cruel affair later, she disappeared across state lines and never looked back. So I stepped in. Not because anyone asked me to, but because love doesn't wait for an invitation. Madison was bright, brilliant really, not just in grades, but in joy. She would sit at the old baby grand in my living room, legs too short to reach the pedals, and bang out little nonsense songs, laughing like it was the greatest concert of all time. I taught her real pieces eventually, Claire de Lune by the time she was 10. She had a gift. But more than that, she had this way of making you feel like everything you did for her mattered. I went to every school play, every recital, every band concert, even when she only had 1 line or 2 notes to play. I packed extra lunches, signed permission slips, stayed up late sewing Halloween costumes, and kept a scrapbook of every little award she ever got. I told myself, one day she'll know. One day she'll remember who never missed a thing. Years passed. She got into college, studied communications, dated a few boys, and eventually met Chad Montgomery. He was polished, polite, from a wealthy banking family out of Georgia, the kind of family that throws garden parties with real silverware and has their names engraved on brass plaques in country clubs. When Madison called me to say he'd proposed, she was breathless with excitement. "Bah," she squealed, her childhood nickname for me. "He got down on one knee in the vineyard. There were string lights and a jazz trio and everything." I was thrilled. Truly, I knew this would change her life, elevate her in a way I could never have done on my own. That night, I sat alone at the piano, played Debussy's Reverie, and cried, not from sadness, but from a strange kind of joy that only comes from seeing someone you love move forward, even if it means they're moving away from you. A week later, Caleb called. "We're going to need help, Mom," he said. "The Montgomerys, well, their guest list is massive, their expectations too. And Chad's father, he's not too big on splitting costs with the bride's side." I didn't even hesitate. "Tell them I'll pay for the whole thing, so," I said. "Whatever it takes. I want this day to be perfect for Madison." There was silence on the other end of the line, followed by, "Are you sure? That's a big commitment." But I had already made it, years ago when I'd promised a scared 4-year-old girl that I'd never leave her side. The next morning, I pulled out my old savings ledger. I had just over $120,000 tucked away. Retirement I never touched. Frugality I'd practiced like a religion. That money was meant for security, maybe some home renovations or a last-minute health emergency. But none of that felt more important than this moment. When I told Madison, her face lit up in a way I hadn't seen in years. "Bah! You're unbelievable. This means so much. I promise I'll make you proud." She hugged me so tight I could barely breathe. Caleb kissed my forehead and said, "We'll make sure you're treated like a queen that day, Mom. I believe them." Over the next few weeks, the invoices started to arrive. Floral designers, caterers, the country club venue. It added up fast. I paid each one without complaint. I even smiled when Madison texted me pictures of monogrammed napkins and hand-carved invitations. "This is your legacy," I told myself. "She'll remember this forever." And in the quiet of my home, with my husband's old photo smiling back at me from the mantel, I believed I was doing something good, something sacred, something only a grandmother could do. But love, when taken for granted, turns into something else entirely. And I would soon learn that no matter how much you give, there are those who will still look you in the eye and say you don't belong. From the moment I agreed to pay for Madison's wedding, I thought I was helping build a future, one filled with hope, family, and new beginnings. But little by little, something began to change. It was subtle at first, a coldness in her voice, a hesitation in the words, like a song losing its melody without notice. I brushed it aside, telling myself I was overthinking, that planning a wedding was stressful for everyone. But deep down, I knew that the warmth I once shared with Madison was slipping through my fingers, and no amount of money would fix it. The first sign was the wedding planner, Eleanor. She was polite when I first spoke with her, but quickly made it clear that she only communicated with Caleb and Madison. When I asked to meet her or discuss the floral arrangements, Eleanor smiled tight and said, "Mrs. Whitley, everything is under control. We wouldn't want to confuse things by adding more voices." I remember sitting at my kitchen table, staring at the screen as I reread that email, the words, "No more voices," burning into my heart. It was as if I was being told, gently but firmly, that I was no longer a part of the conversation. Then came the invitation to the dress fitting. Madison had once told me years ago that I would be there when she chose her gown, that I was the only person who understood her taste. But when I called to ask if I could attend, her voice was cool. "Grandma, the designer's appointment is private," she said. "Just trust me. I want it to be a surprise." I tried to hold on to the hope that maybe this was just a new tradition, something special between mother and daughter. But when the invitations arrived, the family and friends list did not include me. It hurt. What hurt even more was Caleb's reaction when I confronted him. I remember that night, my hands trembling as I dialed his number. When he finally picked up, his voice was tired, worn down by months of planning, by family expectations I didn't understand. "Mom, please," he said softly. "Eleanor says it's best if you don't make waves. Madison's worried about the Montgomerys. They have their own ways. This is just how they do things." "How they do things?" I echoed, my voice breaking. "Caleb, this is my granddaughter's wedding. I'm paying for everything. How can I not be part of this?" There was a long pause on the other end. Then, "Mom, I'm sorry. I know it feels unfair, but it's their world, not ours. Please don't make this harder for Madison." I wanted to scream, to cry, to tell him that this wasn't just unfair. It was cruel. But all I could do was nod to the empty room, tears blurring my vision. As the weeks passed, my involvement shrank. Invitations to meetings ceased. Phone calls went unanswered or redirected. The planner sent me invoices, but when I asked for details, I was told to speak to Caleb. The flowers were not what Madison had once described to me during a late-night phone call. No pastel roses or gardenias, but massive displays that felt cold and showy. The menu was exotic, with dishes I didn't recognize and wine pairings that felt like a different language. And then came the final blow, the rehearsal dinner. An elegant envelope arrived with crisp calligraphy, inviting the wedding party to an intimate gathering at the Montgomery family's private yacht club. My name was not on the list. I called Caleb again, the lump in my throat so heavy I could barely speak. "I'm not invited to the rehearsal dinner," I said quietly. His sigh was long and full of defeat. Mom, it's a tradition. It's for the wedding party only. Please don't make a scene. I'm not making a scene, I whispered. I'm just telling the truth. But he didn't answer. That night, I sat in my quiet house, the silence pressing in around me like a weight. I thought about all the sacrifices I had made, the years of work, the late nights grading papers, the small moments I missed because I was teaching, because I was saving, because I believed family came first. And yet, I was invisible. At that moment, I thought about you, anyone who's ever given their all and been met with cold shoulders or harsh whispers. If you've ever felt the sting of being cast aside, you're not alone. Sometimes the people who should love us most become the hardest to reach. If this story resonates, I hope you'll stay with me. There's more to come. Because sometimes the hardest part isn't being denied, it's deciding what you'll do next. She had chosen the lavender dress because Madison once told her it was the color of hope. Now, as Lorraine Whitley stood at the foot of the marble staircase leading to the grand entrance of the Montgomery family's lakeside estate in Georgia, that color felt heavy on her shoulders. The late afternoon sun glinted off the lake beyond the pillars, turning the water into silvered glass. She took a slow breath, smoothing the silk bodice with a trembling hand. In her purse rested the engraved music box she'd brought as a gift, the one that played a lullaby Madison loved as a child. This was her moment. After years of sacrifice, she would finally stand beside her granddaughter and watch her walk into the next chapter of her life. Instead, she found herself frozen by a clipboard. The attendant at the bottom of the stairs was a young man in a crisp navy uniform. He looked professional, courteous even, until he looked down at his list and back at her face with a polite frown. "I'm sorry, ma'am," he said, his voice careful. "I don't see your name here." Lorraine's heart lurched. "My name is Lorraine Whitley. I'm the grandmother of the bride." He swallowed and flipped the tablet around so she could see. "Ma'am, there's no Lorraine Whitley on our guest list." His eyes flicked to the register, his posture suggesting he was already preparing to move on to the next arriving guest. She tried to steady her voice. "There must be a mistake. My son, Caleb Whitley. He's hosting." The attendant hesitated, fingers tapping the screen. "I'm sorry, ma'am. The capacity is strictly limited. We've already met the maximum. Perhaps you could—" He cleared his throat. "Perhaps you could speak with Mr. Whitley." Lorraine's cheeks burned. The last thing she wanted was to involve Caleb in her humiliation, but she yanked out her phone anyway. Hands shaking, she called him. The line rang 3 times before he picked up, heavy with urgency. "Mom!" His voice was breathless. "What are you doing there?" She glanced back at the marble steps, the guests in evening gowns streaming past, pausing only to smile at each other. She forced calm into her tone. "I'm at the front gate. They say I'm not invited." Silence. Then, "Ma'am," the attendant interjected, voice firm but sympathetic, "I really need you to resolve this with your son." Lorraine covered the phone's speaker with her hand. "Caleb, please, just fix it." She heard him swallow. "Mom, listen. They've got a family-only policy at the entrance now. It's not your fault. Please just go home. Don't make a scene." His words dripped with desperation, but also with something she couldn't quite place, shame maybe, or fear. She bristled. "Family-only policy?" she echoed, voice rising despite her best effort to remain collected. "You asked me to cover every expense, every flower, every course, every chair. Now you won't even let me through the gate?" He exhaled sharply. "That's how they want it. Please, Mom." She looked back at the attendant who was watching the conversation with wide eyes. Lorraine pressed the phone to her ear again. "Caleb, I paid for 50 seats. 50! Did you forget that?" His sigh was weary, defeated. "Mom, I'm sorry. Just come home. We'll talk later." And with that, he hung up. The click of the phone wasn't loud, but it echoed inside her chest like a hammer against glass. She stood rooted to the spot, the engraved music box growing heavy in her hand. Guests in designer gowns and tuxedos passed within arm's reach, none offering so much as a glance. A cluster of older women laughed nearby, pearls and silk scarves glinting in the sun. One of them tilted her head and whispered to her companion. Lorraine could have sworn she saw pity flicker in their eyes before they turned away. She swallowed a sob and slipped her phone back into her purse, tucking the cord of her hearing aid behind her ear. She let the attendant close his tablet with a soft beep. "Ma'am," he said again, voice gentle, "I recommend you head back to your car." Lorraine nodded, teetering on the edge of collapse. She started down the steps, each one echoing under her heels like a drumbeat. The expansive lawn that should have been a stage for her granddaughter's joy felt like a gauntlet stretching out before her. In her mind, she replayed every moment of her life with Madison, teaching her to read music, comforting her through scraped knees, driving her to recitals at dawn. Each precious memory glinted now like shards of ice. By the time she reached her car, the sun had dipped behind the treetops, leaving the estate in cooling shadow. She unlocked the door and collapsed into the driver's seat, pressing her forehead against the steering wheel. The music box clinked against her side. She closed her eyes against tears, but nothing would stop them. She thought of Madison's face when she told her she wasn't invited. She thought of Caleb's voice full of apology and fear. She thought of the millions of dollars the Montgomery family had presumably spent on this day, and the $120,000 she had contributed, only to be discarded like an afterthought. Her breath caught in her throat when she remembered something Madison once said during a piano lesson. "Grandma, you're like the music in the spaces between the notes. Without you, the song wouldn't be the same, but a song without its music can still play," she realized, though it's hollow, missing its soul. The engine ticked, cooling in the silence of the cabin. Lorraine ran her hand along the dashboard, cold metal beneath her palm. She took another shaky breath, reached into her bag, and pulled out the small blue folder she'd labeled Wedding, Final Payments. It held every contract, every invoice, every email confirming her commitment. She opened it on the passenger seat and began to flip through. For a moment, she felt the old pain, the ache of being unwanted, unseen. But beneath it, there was something else, a spark of something she hadn't felt in years. It wasn't anger in its purest form, it was clarity. She closed the folder with a gentle snap and tucked it back into her bag. The tears dried on her cheeks as decisively as they had fallen. She sat upright, hands steady on the wheel. Outside, the estate lights glowed against the darkening sky, but she didn't look again. She started the car and pulled onto the road, leaving the gilded gates and the facade of family behind her. That night, she didn't listen to music. Instead, she sat by her kitchen table in Dallas, the clock ticking on the wall, and she thought about everything she had given and everything she had been denied. She thought about the price she was about to pay for those denials, and she realized that the story was only just beginning. Lorraine Whitley sat at her kitchen table late that night, the only light coming from the small lamp beside her laptop. The house was silent, but for the distant hum of the refrigerator. She'd driven all the way home from the Montgomery estate in a haze, her lavender dress still folded carefully in the passenger seat. Now, in sweatpants and slippers, she opened her inbox with a tremor in her fingers, partly expecting flowers from the planner or a polite apology. Instead, nestled between a sale alert from her favorite bookstore and a reminder for her annual Medicare checkup, was an email with the subject line, Final Guest List Update. Her breath hitched. She clicked it open. From Eleanor Sterling to Caleb Whitley, subject per bride's request. Guest list amendment. Caleb Chad. As discussed, please remove Lorraine Whitley from the final guest list, effective immediately. The bride has expressed that she makes me uncomfortable around my new in-laws, and both groom's family and venue management have agreed. No objections noted from either of you. Thank you for your cooperation. Eleanor Sterling. Senior Event Planner, Montgomery Events. She read it twice, then a third time, as if the words might reshape themselves into something less brutal. They didn't. Lorraine stared at the screen, feeling the familiar ache in her chest that comes with knowing you've been deliberately erased. She closed her eyes and let her head drop into her hands. The email had been sent to her by mistake, but it was real. This wasn't an accident. It was a cold, calculated rejection, drafted in black and white, witnessed by her own family. For years, she'd believed love was enough. Now she realized that in their world, love was conditional, something to be dispensed or revoked at a moment's notice. Lorraine sat up straight, wiped away a stray tear, and inhaled. She pushed the laptop aside and reached for the blue folder labeled Wedding. Final payments resting on the corner of the table. Inside were every contract she'd signed, every deposit slip, every email confirming her financial commitment. $25,000 for the venue, $19,500 for catering, $7,000 for the bridal gown, plus invoices for flowers, musicians, linens, and even an ice sculpture shaped like two swans forming a heart. The total approached $112,500. She ran her finger down the list, each number another testament to her devotion, and they responded by taking her out of their carefully curated world. "I didn't come this far to be treated like a ghost," she whispered to the empty kitchen. With deliberate calm, she picked up her phone and dialed the number on the back of her credit card. "Thank you for calling card services," said a male voice after 2 rings. "This is Marcus. How can I help you tonight?" "Hi, Marcus. My name is Lorraine Whitley. I need to report a dispute on several large pending charges from Montgomery events and related vendors." "Okay, ma'am. Can you verify your account information, please?" She provided her details without hesitation. Marcus asked her to explain the situation. "I funded an event, a wedding, for my granddaughter," she said evenly. "I was deliberately denied entry to the event, and evidence shows my services were not rendered to me as the card holder." There was a pause, a quiet hum of typing. "So, you're saying the event planners prevented you from attending the wedding you paid for?" "Yes. I have an email stating I was removed from the guest list at the bride's request. Therefore, the vendors did not deliver services to me, per our contractual agreement." Marcus cleared his throat. "That is unusual. Ma'am, could you provide the vendor names and the pending amounts?" Lorraine answered methodically. "Montgomery Hills Country Club, final balance $75,000, pending at midnight tonight. Gilded Spoon Catering, $32,000, due in 3 days. Petals and Promises, florist, $21,000, due tomorrow. Ice Swan Creations, $10,000, due upon delivery." "Understood," Marcus said. "I'm flagging all these as disputed. I'll place a temporary hold on them and initiate a formal investigation. You won't be held liable for any of these charges during the process." Lorraine exhaled, a wave of relief mingled with something sharper. Satisfaction. "Thank you, Marcus. That's all I needed. Is there anything else I can do for you today?" "No, thank you. Good night." She hung up and sat back, the phone heavy in her hand. The money was safe for now, but that was only defense. Lorraine turned back to her laptop and opened a new email. She addressed it to the wedding planner, venue manager, caterer, florist, and band leader, every contact she could find in her folder. The subject line read, "Urgent Liability Update, Whitley Montgomery Wedding." Her fingers hovered over the keys, then began to type with crisp precision. "Dear Ms. Sterling and vendor teams, as of 8:15 p.m. Central Time, I have formally disputed and canceled all pending and future payments on my credit accounts related to the wedding of Madison Whitley and Chad Montgomery. As I was deliberately and publicly removed from the event, which I wholly financed, the contractual agreement for my payment of services is null and void. Please redirect all invoices and liabilities to the bride and groom, Madison and Chad Montgomery, for their immediate settlement. Sincerely, Lorraine Whitley." She reread it twice, then clicked send. Outside her window, the street was calm. Inside, her world had shifted. She closed her laptop and leaned back in her chair, letting the silence claim her once more. But this silence felt different, empowered, even serene. She wasn't going to scream or plead. She had spoken, with actions more powerful than any tirade. Across town, somewhere beneath the chandeliers at the Montgomery estate, music faltered mid-song. The band leader caught the sound of his phone buzzing, glanced at his screen, and his face drained of color. A hush rippled through the ballroom as the DJ abruptly cut the record, leaving tinny static in its wake. Servers paused with trays in midair. Guests exchanged confused whispers as the open bar suddenly shut down, expensive bottles whisked away by order of the manager. In that moment of collective bewilderment, Lorraine felt no triumph, only a profound, quiet satisfaction that her story and her worth could not be erased. The playlist of her life's sacrifices had entered a new movement, one of remembrance, clarity, and unspoken justice. Soon enough, the fallout would spread through every circle. Family gossip, social media murmurs, vendor phone calls, and maybe even a lawsuit. But Lorraine sat alone in her kitchen, the lamp casting a warm pool of light over her blue folder and empty coffee cup. She sipped the last of her chamomile tea and closed her eyes, letting the gravity of her choice settle in her bones. Tomorrow, she would wake free of their whispers and their need for her money. Tomorrow, she would begin to chart her own future, one not defined by unpaid debts or invisible roles, but by the knowledge that her voice mattered, even when spoken in calm resolve. Because actions, she finally understood, hold more power than words, and some lessons once learned echo through a lifetime. The fallout from the wedding disaster rippled through social media before dawn. By the time Lorraine Whitley woke, her phone buzzed with dozens of alerts, threads speculating why the band stopped mid-song, whispers about the shuttered bar, and rumors that the bride's family was scrambling to cover unpaid bills. Lorraine didn't look. She sat up in her simple Dallas bedroom, the rising sun casting soft light on bare walls. For the first time in years, she felt neither panic nor regret, only a clear sense of purpose. She slipped out of stale pajamas, tied back her hair, and began packing. No more tears, no more waiting for apologies that would never come. It was time to leave. Within hours, she was on a flight to Kyoto, Japan, clutching a carry-on stuffed with comfortable clothes and a well-worn sketchbook. As the plane climbed above midnight city lights, Lorraine pressed her forehead against the window and watched homes shrink to pinpoints of light. Dallas felt like another life, one defined by unspoken demands and silent betrayals. Ahead of her lay narrow streets lined with rice paddies, ancient temples, and the promise of clay beneath her fingers. She closed her eyes, imagining the earthy scent of damp soil, the soft grind of a potter's wheel. Here, she hoped, she would find herself again. Stepping off the shuttle at a small inn near the Kamo River, Lorraine inhaled deeply. The air was laced with the scent of cherry blossoms and simmering miso. She smiled for the first time in days, savoring the simplicity of unfamiliar surroundings. After a quick shower, she walked the cobblestone path to a little pottery studio, tucked between a noodle shop and a bookstore that smelled of green tea. A faded wooden sign read, "Nakamura Ceramics." Inside, warm light glowed off rows of imperfect bowls and vases, each piece whispering stories of two hands shaping clay into form. She signed in quietly and took a seat at one of the low tables. Soon, a woman in her 60s, hair pulled into a neat bun, glided across the room. "Irashaimase," the teacher said with a gentle bow. Lorraine replied with a nervous "hello" and a small smile. The woman's name was Ms. Hiroko Nakajima. Everyone called her Hiroko-san. She spoke little English, but her eyes were kind. Through a few shared words, gestures, and long pauses, Lorraine understood the plan. Start with a ball of clay, wedge it to remove air bubbles, center it on the wheel, then shape. Wet clay felt cool and heavy in Lorraine's palms, like memories slipping through her fingers. She wedged the lump against the wooden board, pressing out air pockets, folding it over on itself. Hiroko-san demonstrated the wheel's rhythm. Press with both hands, breathe with the spin. Lorraine sat at the foot pedal, water dripping onto the floor, and let the wheel hum beneath her. The clay wobbled at first, then began to steady as her hands found their groove. She felt her chest unclench with every gentle push and pull. As she shaped the first bowl, Hiroko-san stood beside her, murmuring encouragement. Lorraine didn't understand the words, but the tone was unmistakable. The teacher's calm praise flowed through touch, a gentle tap at the back of Lorraine's hand, a nod of approval. When Lorraine smoothed the rim, Hiroko-san closed her eyes and smiled, then patted Lorraine's shoulder. Lorraine's heart fluttered. She realized she had not felt seen like this in a long time, not as a wallet, not as an obligation, but as a fellow human being with something to give and receive. Later, in the small courtyard behind the studio, Lorraine set her bowl to dry on wooden slats. The afternoon sun warmed her face as she stared at a cluster of cherry trees blooming overhead. She ran a hand through her hair, thinking of the Montgomery's crystalline chandeliers and the cold clip of an email that declared, "She makes me uncomfortable." But here, in this moment, she tasted something new, the quiet pride of creation. The bowl was imperfect, one side slightly higher than the other, but to her, it felt like birth. In the days that followed, Lorraine fell into a gentle routine. Mornings began with green tea in a tiny cafe run by a friendly barista named Emmy. Lorraine pointed at pastries in the display case, and Emmy chuckled, slicing off a warm milk loaf that melted in Lorraine's mouth. Afternoons were spent at Nakamura Ceramics, learning to throw vases and cups, her sleeves rolled up, water dripping from her elbows. Evenings, she wandered through Gion's lantern-lit alleys, listening to distant temple bells and the soft laughter of passers-by. She could feel curiosity flicker in her chest, like the first spark of a match. Occasionally, Hiroko-san invited Lorraine to help unload now dry pieces from the kiln. The shelves were lined with pottery in muted tones of ash and moss, each piece bearing the subtle fingerprints of its maker. When Lorraine reached for a recently fired cup, her fingers marveled at the smooth glaze, cool to the touch. "Subarashi," Hiroko-san murmured, and Lorraine felt a rush of connection. Two women separated by language and culture, sharing in the alchemy of earth and fire. At night, Lorraine sat in her ryokan room, the paper lantern casting gentle shadows on the tatami mats. She opened her sketchbook and doodled vases and bowls she might shape someday. She thought about Madison's wedding, Conway's heirloom invitations, and the shame of being banished from the very event she financed. But that life felt distant now, like a half-remembered dream. Her world had narrowed to the curve of clay on the wheel, the whisper of glaze brushing clay, the resonance of her own heartbeat in a quiet studio. One afternoon, as Hiroko-san led a group of students in a demonstration of foot-driven wheel techniques, Lorraine caught her own reflection in a window. She saw a woman whose shoulders held no weight of unpaid debts or unwanted invitations. Her eyes were steady, curious, and alive. The jasmine air drifted through the screen door, carrying the promise of more lessons, both in ceramics and in self-worth. Lorraine smiled, genuine and unforced. This was her rebirth, a quiet one. She had left behind the world that tried to silence her and found a place where her hands and heart mattered. Here, she could create, connect, and heal, one bowl at a time. It had been almost a year since Lorraine Whitley was turned away at the gates of her granddaughter's wedding. In that time, the world she left behind, the crystal chandeliers, the soaring string quartet, the polite nods of distant relatives, had tumbled into chaos. Madison and Chad's marriage crashed under the weight of unpaid bills and shattered expectations. Caleb, overwhelmed by debt he hadn't fully understood, sold the family home in Dallas and disappeared from social media. But Lorraine? Lorraine found something no one could ever take away: herself. By spring, she'd settled into a modest apartment on the outskirts of Kyoto. The sliding paper doors opened onto a narrow courtyard where moss crouched between stones, and to the far side, a small cherry tree blossomed with a reckless abandon that made her smile every morning. Her furniture was sparse: a low table, a futon, a bookshelf of dog-eared novels in English and Japanese, but each item felt chosen, like an extension of her own quiet renewal. Each day, she went to Nakamura Ceramics, where she'd earned her nickname, Sensei Lorraine, from children who clamored for her gentle guidance. She taught a weekly afternoon class of expat mothers and local school kids who watched in fascination as her hands coaxed lumps of clay into cups and bowls in a dance of water and motion. Sometimes she caught a child's eye as she trimmed a freshly fired vase, and they'd squeal, "Sensei, I want to be just like you when I grow up." Her heart swelled. This was real recognition, born of creativity, not conditional approval. The news of Madison's divorce arrived in fragments: a forwarded article in a local Dallas paper, an apologetic text from her niece Sarah. Lorraine read about the legal filings, how Madison and Chad had faced each other across a judge's bench, debt piled between them like an impenetrable wall. Then she heard Caleb had taken a job in another state, one that paid less but demanded anonymity. In those reports, she heard a distant echo of her old life, like a record played too slowly. One afternoon, after class, she walked to the little noodle shop next door. Emmy, the barista, greeted her with the same warm smile she'd learned to rely on. "Lorraine-san, your usual?" Emmy poured green tea into a chipped porcelain cup. Lorraine nodded and took a slow sip, savoring the steam on her lips. "It's good," she said softly. "Just good." Emmy chuckled. "You look happy, Sensei." Lorraine closed her eyes against the sunlight. "I am. More than I've been in a long while." Later, she wandered along the Kamo River, the willows brushing the water's surface like lazy dancers. She thought of the copy of her email, sent to every vendor, sitting in a folder on her laptop, each word chosen with calm precision. She thought of the stunned silence that had fallen over the wedding reception as servers collected plates and guests fumbled for their own wallets. She thought of Madison's face, reddened by shame or anger, and felt a pang. Brief, distant, almost foreign. At dusk, she returned to her apartment and sat by the open window, the air drifting and cool and sweet with jasmine. She picked up her sketchbook and flipped to a blank page, then drew the outline of a simple bowl. Imperfect, slightly lopsided. That was the point. It was hers. A knock sounded on the door. Lorraine set the sketchbook aside and opened it to find her niece, Sarah, holding a box of honey cookies from a neighborhood bakery in Dallas. "I wanted to see you," Sarah said, stepping inside. She placed the cookies on the table, glanced around the sparsely decorated room, and then met Lorraine's eyes. "I can't stop hearing about how amazing your kiln is, how you're teaching, how you look free." Lorraine watched Sarah carefully. "I am," she said simply. Sarah hesitated. "I'm sorry about everything, about how they treated you." Lorraine shook her head. "I don't need apologies. I needed recognition for who I am, not just what I paid for." Tears glistened in Sarah's eyes. "You deserve so much more than pity. I'm proud of you." Lorraine reached across the table and squeezed her niece's hand. "Thank you." Later that evening, Lorraine sat before her altar of pottery, a newly glazed tea set, a few drying bowls, and her favorite, a simple plate etched with the words, "I am enough." She closed her eyes and whispered into the quiet room, "I did this for me." Hey everyone, I'd love to hear from you. Have you ever been pushed out of a place you thought was yours, only to find a new beginning somewhere unexpected? Share your story in the comments below. Your voice matters here as much as mine does.